There's a reason why some people seem to manifest effortlessly, while others keep trying, learning, applying every technique they can find, and still feel like nothing really changes. And the difference is not what most people think. It's not about how much they visualize, how many affirmations they repeat, or how positive they stay throughout the day. The real difference is much more subtle than that. The 1% don't manifest better because they are doing more. They manifest better because they are doing less of the one thing that blocks everyone else. Most people approach manifestation like a process that needs to be managed. They try to control their thoughts, fix their emotions, maintain a certain state, and constantly check if they are aligned. And from the outside, that looks like discipline. It looks like commitment. It looks like they are doing everything right. But internally, they are constantly interrupting the signal. They think the thought, and then question it. They feel the state, and then analyze it. They align for a moment, and then check if it's working. And every time they do that, they reset the process. From a neuroscience perspective, this creates instability in the brain. New neural patterns start forming, but before they stabilize, they are interrupted by old patterns of doubt, control, and over-awareness. So instead of becoming automatic, the new identity remains temporary. From a quantum perspective, this is even more precise. Because manifestation is not about generating a signal once. It's about holding it without interruption. And this is what the 1% understand intuitively. They don't try to constantly fix their state. They don't monitor every thought. They don't react to every internal fluctuation. They allow the state to stabilize. And that changes everything, because the field does not respond to intensity. It responds to consistency. And consistency is not built through effort. It is built through lack of interference. This is why most people stay stuck. Not because they don't know enough, but because they are constantly disrupting what they already started. They touch the state, but they don't remain in it. They align, but they don't trust it. They begin the process, but they don't allow it to complete. And until that changes, nothing else will. Because manifestation is not about learning more, it's about stopping what is breaking it. You're going to understand the first thing the 1% do differently, and why it has nothing to do with thinking more positively, but everything to do with how they relate to their identity. What separates the 1% from everyone else is not that they have better techniques. It's that they relate to identity differently. While most people are trying to get into the right state, trying to feel aligned, trying to think correctly, the 1% are not trying to enter a state. They are operating from one. And that distinction is everything. Because when you are trying to enter a state, you are still outside of it. There is still a gap between who you are and who you are attempting to become. That gap creates effort, and that effort creates instability. You have to maintain it, monitor it, correct it, and the moment your attention shifts, the state weakens. But when you are operating from a state, there is no effort to maintain it. There is no need to check if you are aligned. There is no need to constantly return to it because you never left. It becomes the lens through which you think, feel, and interpret reality. This is what Joe Dispenza means when he says you have to become a new personality. Not temporarily, not during meditation, not during a specific practice, but consistently enough that your brain and body begin to memorize it as familiar. Because once something becomes familiar, it stops requiring effort. From a neuroscience perspective, this is the transition from conscious processing to automatic identity. The new neural pathways are no longer something you activate intentionally. They become the default. Your reactions change without you needing to think about them. Your perception shifts without effort. Your decisions align naturally with who you are being. And that is when manifestation begins to accelerate. Because now, there is no contradiction. There is no gap between what you think and what you feel. There is no internal conflict between your intention and your expectation. There is no fluctuation between states that creates instability in the signal you are sending. There is coherence. From a quantum perspective, coherence is what allows reality to reorganize. It is not the strength of a single moment, but the consistency of your state over time. When your thoughts, your emotions, and your identity align without interruption, the signal becomes stable enough to collapse into experience. Most people never reach this point because they are constantly moving in and out of the state. They feel aligned for a moment, and then they go back to analyzing, questioning, or waiting. They touch the identity, but they don't stay there long enough for it to become natural. The 1% do something different. They stop trying to feel it perfectly. They stop trying to hold it all the time, and instead they allow it to become simple, less forced, less monitored, more natural. They don't treat the state as something fragile that can break if they make a mistake. They treat it as something stable that doesn't require constant attention. And because of that, it begins to stabilize in the background. This is where the shift happens. Not when you feel it strongly for a few minutes, but when it becomes the quiet baseline of who you are. When you are no longer trying to be that version of yourself, but you are also no longer returning to the old one. That in-between disappears. And what remains is identity. Once that happens, manifestation stops feeling like something you are working toward. It starts feeling like something that is already in motion. Not because you forced it, but because you are no longer interrupting the version of yourself that already has it. And this is where the next layer becomes even more counterintuitive. Because the 1% are not focused on what they want in the way most people are. They are not constantly thinking about the outcome, visualizing it, or trying to bring it closer. They are focused on something much more precise, something that determines everything without looking like it does. Most people believe manifestation is about focusing on what you want. They visualize it, think about it, try to feel it, repeat it in their mind over and over again, hoping that consistency and attention will eventually bring it into reality. And while attention does play a role, this is where the majority get stuck without realizing it. Because the 1% are not focused on the outcome in the way most people are. They are focused on who they are while the outcome is not here yet. That is the difference. Because focusing on the outcome keeps it in front of you. Stabilizing your identity brings it into you. From a neurological standpoint, what you repeatedly focus on strengthens certain neural pathways. But if that focus is always directed at something external, something you don't yet have, your brain continues to register it as separate from you. It becomes something you are aware of, not something you are being, and that distinction keeps it at a distance. This is why people can visualize something for months, even years, and still feel like it's not part of their life. Because they are reinforcing the awareness of it, without integrating it into their identity. The 1% do something different. They don't just think about the result. They adjust their self-perception until the result becomes a natural extension of who they are. This is subtle, but it changes everything, because self-perception determines interpretation, and interpretation determines experience. If you see yourself as someone who is still trying to get there, still figuring it out, still working towards something, your brain filters reality through that lens. It looks for evidence that matches that identity. It interprets situations in a way that reinforces that version of you. Even if you are thinking positively, even if you are doing everything right, but when your self-perception shifts, your entire interaction with reality changes. You don't react the same way. You don't interpret things the same way. You don't assign the same meaning to what happens. And that shift begins to reorganize everything. From a quantum perspective, this is the role of the observer. You are not just witnessing reality. You are selecting it through the identity you are holding. The version of you that you stabilize determines which version of reality becomes more probable in your experience. And that selection is not made through effort. It is made through consistency of identity. This is why the 1% don't obsess over outcomes. They don't need to. Because once identity stabilizes, the outcome is no longer something separate. It becomes a reflection. And reflections don't need to be chased. They appear naturally. This is where the process becomes quieter, less forced, less dramatic. Because now, you are not trying to bring something into your life. You are allowing your life to reorganize around who you have become. And that shift removes a massive amount of friction. Because there is no longer a gap between you and what you want. There is no longer a sense of getting closer. There is no longer a feeling of waiting. There is only alignment. And when alignment becomes stable, manifestation stops feeling like something that happens in moments. It becomes something that unfolds continuously, without needing constant attention. This is the point where most people would expect things to immediately appear, but the 1% understand something even deeper. They understand that what truly determines speed is not how clearly you see the outcome, but how little you interfere with the process once alignment is there. And that is where the final shift happens, the one that almost no one talks about, because it doesn't look like action at all, but it changes everything. There is a point in this process where most people unknowingly slow everything down, and it doesn't look like a mistake. It looks like awareness. It looks like intelligence. It looks like they are paying attention to their reality and adjusting accordingly. But this is exactly where the interference comes back in a much more refined form, because reacting to reality, even subtly, re-anchors you to it. Most people, even after understanding identity, still look at their current circumstances to evaluate progress. They observe what is happening, what is not happening, what is changing, what is staying the same, and they use that information to decide how they feel, what they think, and whether they are on the right track. And that creates a loop. They align internally, then they check externally. They stabilize for a moment, then they measure it against reality. They feel certain, then they look for confirmation. And that single movement is enough to break coherence. Because the moment you react to what you see, you are no longer operating from identity, you are adjusting to feedback. And when you adjust to feedback, you reinforce the current reality instead of allowing it to change. From a neuroscience perspective, this is the brain returning to familiar prediction models. When you look at your external world and use it as reference, your brain immediately activates existing patterns that match that environment. It pulls you back into the same interpretations, the same emotional responses, the same identity that has been associated with those conditions. So even if you are aligned internally, the external pulls you back. Not because it's stronger, but because you responded to it. From a quantum perspective, this is the observer collapsing the same reality again. You are not just seeing what is there. You are confirming it through attention, through interpretation, and through emotional reinforcement. And every time you do that, you stabilize the current version instead of allowing a new one to emerge. This is why the 1% operate differently. They don't ignore reality in a forced or delusional way. They simply stop reacting to it as if it defines them. They see it, but they don't take it as instruction. They understand that reality is not something to respond to. It is something that is catching up. And that subtle shift removes one of the biggest sources of interference in the entire process. Because now, your internal state is no longer being adjusted based on external feedback. It becomes self-sustained. It becomes stable without needing confirmation. And when that happens, reality has no resistance to reorganize. This is where manifestation begins to feel effortless. Not because you are doing something extraordinary, but because you stop doing what was slowing it down. You stop checking, you stop measuring, you stop reacting. And in that space, something very precise happens. Your identity remains constant. And when identity remains constant, reality has only one direction to move: toward you. This is why the 1% don't look for signs. They don't need them, because they are no longer using reality to determine who they are. They are using who they are to determine reality. And once that becomes natural, once that stops being something you are trying to do and starts being something you are, the entire process changes. Because now, there is nothing left interrupting it from the outside. But there is still one final layer that determines everything, and it is the most counterintuitive of all. It is the moment where you stop trying to accelerate manifestation, and that is exactly when it becomes faster than ever. There is a point in this process where the last layer of interference becomes visible, and it is the one almost no one questions, because it feels justified. It feels logical. It feels like you are simply trying to make things happen faster, to move forward, to not waste time. But underneath that intention, there is something else operating: the need for acceleration. Most people, even after understanding identity, even after stabilizing their internal state, still carry a subtle urgency, a quiet pressure that says things should be happening already, that results should start appearing, that something should shift soon. And that pressure doesn't always show up as anxiety. Sometimes it shows up as anticipation, as excitement, as the feeling that something is about to happen. But even that creates distance, because urgency in any form reinforces time. And time is what keeps your manifestation in the future. From a neurological perspective, the moment you introduce urgency, your brain shifts back into predictive mode. It starts scanning for when something will happen, how it will happen, and whether there are signs that confirm progress. That shifts your attention away from identity and back into expectation. And expectation, when tied to time, creates instability. You are no longer being it. You are waiting for it. From a quantum perspective, this becomes even more precise. When you hold a sense of urgency, you are reinforcing the idea that what you want is not fully here yet. Even if your thoughts say otherwise, the underlying signal still carries a subtle separation. And that separation is enough to delay the collapse of that reality into your experience. This is why the 1% move differently. They don't try to accelerate manifestation. They remove the need for it. They stop measuring time. They stop thinking in terms of when. They stop anticipating the moment something will appear. And in doing that, they collapse the distance, because when there is no sense of not yet, there is no reason for reality to remain delayed. This is the paradox most people never understand. The more you try to make something happen faster, the more you reinforce that it hasn't happened yet. And the more you reinforce that, the more you stabilize a version of reality where it is still on the way. But when you remove that pressure, when you no longer feel the need for it to happen at a certain time, something shifts internally. You become settled, not passive, not indifferent, but complete. And from that completeness, there is nothing left to wait for. This is the state where manifestation feels instant, not because time disappeared, but because resistance did. The process no longer has anything interrupting it from the inside. There is no contradiction, no effort, no checking, no reacting, no urgency. Only consistency. And consistency is what the field responds to. This is what the 1% understand at a level that most people never reach. They don't chase results, they don't try to control timing, and they don't force alignment. They remove everything that prevents alignment from stabilizing on its own. And once that happens, reality has no choice but to reflect it. If this shifted the way you see manifestation, anchor it. Comment, I am the 1%. Because the moment you stop trying to manifest better than everyone else and start interfering less than everyone else, you already are. There is a moment in this entire process that doesn't feel like a breakthrough, doesn't feel like a peak, and doesn't feel like something extraordinary just happened. In fact, it feels almost the opposite. It feels normal, quiet, stable, almost obvious. And that is exactly how you know something real has shifted. Because manifestation, when it finally stabilizes, stops feeling like manifestation. Up until this point, there was always some level of awareness around it. You were thinking about it, practicing it, adjusting it, trying to stay aligned with it. Even when you were doing it well, there was still a sense that you were in a process. That something was unfolding, that something was coming together, that something was about to happen. But then something changes. You stop thinking about it in the same way. You stop checking how aligned you are. You stop wondering if it's working. Not because you forced yourself to stop, but because the need to ask those questions disappears. And when that need disappears, so does the instability. From a neurological perspective, this is the point where the new identity has become the default. The brain is no longer switching between old and new patterns. It is no longer trying to reconcile different versions of you. The new way of thinking, feeling, and interpreting reality has become automatic. It runs in the background without effort, without attention.